Reem Kassis, welcome. I'm so happy to be starting a conversation with you. Reem is a Palestinian writer whose work focuses on the intersection of food and culture in the region, as well as history and politics. You can find some of her amazing writings in the Wall Street Journal, in the Washington Post, and the New York Times. And of course, her debut cookbook, The Palestinian Table, that was published in 2017. It won the Guild of Food Writers Award and Gourmand World Cookbook Award, and it was nominated for a James Beard Award. Was also shortlisted for the Andre Simon Award and the Edward Stanford Award, mashallah, and was picked as one of NPR's best books of 2017. And he has a second cookbook, which was published in 2021, the Arabesque Table. The Arabesque Table, I'd love to talk about it, but I'd love to hear it from you even more. So Reem, take it away.
So the Arabesque, I come from a very different background, right? I'm not from the food world. And I always thought the Palestinian table was just this one-off thing, I'll do it and then I'd go back to my real life. But it was funny because after that book came out and I really fell very deep into the world of food and I started researching things and learning about the history of our cuisine, I started to see there were so many misconceptions about it, in part about the history of the food, its origins. And I really wanted to write a book that showed what a modern Arabic table might look like, while at the same time not discounting the history that got us to this point. Because you end up a lot of times, I look at the way we eat at home today, and it's very different from the way my grandmother might have eaten with her kids in her house. But to understand why we have the dishes we have today and how they've evolved, to do that with integrity, you really need to go back in history and understand the origins of these foods. And I guess as a Palestinian, for me, this was also very important because it touches on the issue of culinary appropriation, right? You have a lot of dishes being marketed abroad as one thing or other when they're not. And if you're armed with the history, then you have a much better chance of changing the conversation because you're no longer just projecting something that's emotional. You're actually bringing history and facts to the table. And that's what the Arabesque Table really tried to do. So if you look at it, there's a bunch of recipes in there that aren't really traditional, that might look like fusion dishes to many people, but fusion is actually as old as cuisine itself. And if you think back to the spice routes and the trade routes in which, the Islamic and the Arab Empire were the biggest players in the field at the time, our cuisine has been evolving way back since the beginning, from the spices that you're exposed to throughout trade, from different traditions and modes of preparing food to different ingredients. Our food has always been evolving. And I think cookbooks play a very important role in documenting food in a very specific point in time, so that when people come later on and they want to understand the history in the past, then they have these manuals, if you will, with which to understand it better.
Absolutely. No, history is something that I'm extremely passionate about. Food history specifically, it's what I'm personally studying and what I write about, what I do in my free time. And it's absolutely important because it also gives context wherever you are, wherever you're in life you are, to kind of understand why we do things the way we do. The way we do them. It's like we know that this is how I cook or I eat or my neighbor eats, and how we might be different or related, how my mother
But
cooks.
why?
Exactly. Wine, it kind of contextualizes everything for us. And through that, I'm sure, this brings me to my next question, is on working on the Arabesque Table, what were things that you might have not perhaps knew before that kind of were eye-opening for you and you realized? For me, for instance, I feel like going back to history, you touched on the connections that we share. And I'm curious to know how it was like for you.
So look, there's a lot of things I learned that came as a bit of a surprise to me, and I'll get into some of the smaller points in a bit. But I think the biggest takeaway, let's say, I don't want to say surprise because anecdotally I'd heard this a lot, but the biggest takeaway was just how important and influential Arab cuisine has been on the cuisine of the entire world. There are so many dishes that you might eat in Europe today. Something like panna cotta, and you think, well, this is an Italian dish. Yes, it is. But do you know who actually brought the very idea of thickening milk with starch to Europe during the Middle Ages? It was Arab traders. So there were a lot of, little anecdotes like that. And we're going to talk about kakil uts later, so I don't want to spoil it now, but the history of that was also very surprising to me. Other things like rice, which we look at as such a staple in our cuisine, Palestinian cuisine today, it actually wasn't common until just a few decades ago, if you will. We relied more on burghul, frike, wheats ensuing great byproducts. And yet today you look at what we consider our national dishes, something like ma'lube, it's rice-based. And so you start to see how dishes evolve, and that, it's hard to claim something as extremely authentic, but at the same time, that doesn't detract from its importance to your national identity. And I think it was very important for me to see that you're able to put those two things together.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack just in your answer now. I'll take it.
I know.
Amazing. I would love to just go back to the Palestinian Table back in 2017. So it's a lovely book that is extremely helpful for me as in the kitchen as a woman. I love Palestinian food. I see a lot of closeness to farm and land, and the concept of land and freshness and nature and seasonality in it, that is just really beautiful. But aside from the food and the recipes in it, the narrative, your personal narrative that came through at the beginning, at the introduction, or even, at the beginning of each section, or, each recipe or introduction to it, your own story behind it, there was a lot of memory in it. And I'm sure there are I'm a fourth generation migrant myself. So memory there's a lot of displacement, sort of, in my lineage. And I feel memory plays a huge role in whether, my own personal story or point of view, but also in my research and the people I talk to. And I felt that coming through a lot. And I kind of see there's your own Palestinian, or your own narrative as a Palestinian, but also as a Palestinian in diaspora.
Right.
And I'm curious to know your maybe your take on how you think of, if you were still in Palestine and you weren't in diaspora, how different would that be, that role of memory in telling your story?
So to answer your question, I guess I need to explain to you why the book even came about to begin with, right? Yeah. So like you mentioned, I had been living abroad for quite some time when I wrote the Palestinian Table, but what really precipitated it, my background is in business. I was working as a consultant, and then I had my first daughter in London, where we were living at the time. And during maternity leave, I suddenly panicked. There was a part of me that felt like I'm raising my kid away from her homeland, away from all the things that had given me a sense of meaning and rootedness growing up, because I grew up in Jerusalem. And I wanted to basically preserve that for her, give her a piece of home, regardless of where she would be in the world. And I think something that made that feel more urgent was seeing a lot of these restaurants popping up in London at the time, claiming this is Israeli cuisine, and, selling things as Middle Eastern that were nowhere even remotely as good or accurately done as they would be locally. And so I wanted her to kind of know what that was. And when I started working on the book, I was compiling these recipes and stories for my family. I think I took a step back at one point and looked at it, and I said, well, okay, these are my family's recipes and stories and our memories and whatnot. But if you take them together collectively as a whole, they could be the story of any Palestinian family. And those are the stories that you don't often hear. I mean, Selma, I'm sure you're aware, we hear about the politics, you hear about the war, the oppression, all these things, but you don't hear about us often as people, as humans. And we all know the risk of what happens when we're dehumanized. And I thought that, having a book that just simply tells about our food and our history, and like you mentioned, our memories and our stories and all these things, it does help show a different side to us. And that's why I ended up writing the Palestinian Table. But that's also, to answer your question, why it's so rooted in memories and stories, because it started out as a personal project. But then I also realized those were the very stories that people don't often get to know. Now, had I been living back home, would I have even thought to do this book? Probably not. I probably wouldn't have felt that sense of urgency at, there was a Palestinian poet who at one point, the name escapes me, but he said something. He said, we became Palestinians the day we were severed from our country. And it's not that you're not Palestinian when you live in Palestine, but you don't think of it as my, you're there. And I write this in the book, growing up, there was the food we ate at home at my grandmother's houses. And it was our food, but I didn't think of it, this is Palestinian, because I didn't feel it was threatened. I didn't feel it being taken away from me. And then when you're abroad, suddenly you do realize that there is this metaphorical and real threat to your food. You're far away from it. You don't have access to the same ingredients, to the same even kind of occasions in which you get to share these foods. And that's why I think the concept of memory and tradition comes across so much in this book, out of probably nostalgia and, heartache at being so away from my homeland.
Yeah, I think, like you said, displacement has become perhaps part of the identity. And with the Palestinian people, and I think memory definitely plays a big role, especially when it comes to food. It's something, when you're away, like you mentioned in the book, it ignites all these really close memories and moments and interactions and scents and smells from the soup and people and laughter and all that. I'm curious about something that is perhaps quite related. Like you mentioned in the when you started the book, you wanted to humanize Palestinians and humanize the Palestinian heritage, that we're, that the Palestinian people is more than just the cause, obviously. But because your audience, you're writing, who did you have in mind while you were writing the Palestinian Table?
So initially, like I told you, I was thinking of it more on a personal level. But then after that, when I decided to broaden it and actually turn it into a cookbook, there were a few people that I had in mind. The people that I didn't have in mind were the Palestinians back home, mostly because they don't need my book. They have their mothers and their aunts and they have their traditions and they still live these things. Although now in hindsight, I realize that actually it has been very useful to a lot of people back home. But I wanted it to be first and foremost for Palestinians in the diaspora, because for many of us, whether we be first generation, second, third, or fourth, food is sometimes one of the only things we still have, right? Like I know fourth generation Palestinians and Lebanese and Syrians and Egyptians who don't speak a word of the language, who have never visited the country, but they can name every single dish on a table because that's what they eat at home. And so you realize food is one of those things that keeps people connected to their past. And I wanted them to have access to a book that helped them relive those flavors that they might have known either in their childhood or, from previous generations. But then I also wanted the other side of this, the humanizing side, was for the Western world. They're the ones that we often see Palestinians like beseeching and saying, where's the international community? Why aren't you standing with us? But for a lot of them, they don't see us as people, as mothers, as sisters, as cooks, as husbands, as whatnot. They see us just as these people who have this problem. You saw during Ukraine, these brown people, the terrorists, etc. And you want them to start seeing you on par with them. I'm someone who cooks. I'm someone who has a history, a culture, who has stories that you can relate to. So those were the two primary groups, I guess, that I was targeting, which explains also some of the reasons for, the book is written in English, obviously not in Arabic. There was an editorial decision to call all the recipes English names. I didn't like it, but at least we put the Arabic words in the head notes for each recipe.
Yeah, well, but again, was chicken and with sumac and onion, right?
I know. I was like, dude, it's called msakhan. Like, come on. They're like, well, we put msakhan in the head note, but it's, you pick and choose your battles. That's what I realized when you write a cookbook, right? There are certain things that you give and you take in return. But overall, I mean, I was, targeting both Palestinians and non-Palestinians. I didn't think it would be popular at all back home, just because who needs a book in English to tell them how to cook when they know how to cook it? But I realized a lot of people do actually buy it locally in Jerusalem, which was a surprise to me.
That's wonderful. I, in recent, maybe the last 2 years, I've been following your writing in the press. So you've published a couple of, you've written a couple of articles that touches on the Palestinian reality and your personal narrative, and perhaps linking to larger questions of, the nationalization of cuisine or the identity. And perhaps that wasn't as present back in 2017 in the Palestinian Table in your book. So I'm curious, do you see that the appetite for food, but also for Palestinian culture or the Palestinian cause, has it changed? Do you see more awareness, perhaps more readiness to listen?
So a couple of, sorry, what was the last thing?
Or to eat, to listen.
Or to eat, yeah. So there's definitely been a rise, both in the interest in, Palestinian cuisine, but also in the Palestinian story, but in a lot of other marginalized people's stories. And we've seen that across the board in recent years. But I think with the book, and you accurately perceive this, the book was not political by any stretch. There was not even the mention of the word Israel in it once. And that wasn't necessarily a conscious decision. My aim in writing it was to preserve and share our stories and to let the food and those stories speak for themselves. I don't need to come and tell you, this salad is not actually Israeli. No, I could just very simply tell you about its history and its position in our family and how it came to be and whatnot, and that should speak for itself. But like I said, I wasn't from this world, and the more I got immersed in it, I realized there are things that I assumed people would know that I realized actually people don't know. And just because I took it for granted because I grew up around this information or around this research that others would, no, someone needs to actually share that with others. And that's where the whole idea of writing more in the press came from. It was a struggle, actually, because at the beginning, the mainstream press, there are, restrictions on what they do and don't want to publish. And so I think it took quite a few stepping stones to get to the point where I am right now, where I am able to say, for the most part, what I want to say without it being censored, or at least totally censored. But it's, it was an uphill climb. I would say it's getting smoother. I don't know how long that will last.
Yeah,
but I do hope that we're witnessing a change at this point, and
yeah, I mean, no matter what, like you said, at the end of the day, even if you're not saying that this is Palestinian and not Israeli, just that by explaining its history behind it, you are kind of resisting in a way.
Yeah.
So
I've always said we each do it in our own field, right? Like I am working in the area of food. My form of resistance is in, correcting the misinformation that's out there, sharing the history. Someone else who works in politics, there's different avenues that you can take, but I guess we're each doing our bit where we can.
Sure. Returning to the kitchen as a woman after traveling, after education, you wrote in the Palestinian kitchen, and I'm gonna quote that if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Little did I know that my journey would take me back to the place where I started, to the kitchen as a changed person. So a couple of months back, I was presenting something in Doha, and I got asked this question. I was presenting something actually on domesticity and the woman's role in Egypt back in the 50s, right? And then I got asked by a young student who studies in a university there. She was like, how does that make you feel as a woman that you're doing that? When you're talking about it, you're talking about, the issue of domesticity and, maybe putting restrictions and framing, putting women in frames, and you still perhaps are doing it yourself. I would love to hear what you have to say, because my response at the time was perhaps, if I was a man, you wouldn't be asking me that question. But I'd love to hear what you think.
So, the earlier part of that quote and why I didn't want to end up in the kitchen was before I left, someone had, joked in front of my family saying something like, why are you going to bother sending her to university in the US? Don't you know she's going to end up in the kitchen like all Arab women do anyway? And, it's a stereotype, an unfortunate one, but it's also based, unfortunately, in some semblance of reality, right? There's a lot of women. The Arab world has the lowest employment participation rate for women in the whole entire world. And a lot of women end up in the kitchen, or if not, then, they're managing work while managing the kitchen as well. And for me, that was something that I really wanted to escape. So I had that same perception that domesticity and being at home and whatnot were these things that you want to stay away from. And I think one realization I've come to in recent years is that the kitchen can very much be a place of power as well. And the issue is not with domesticity. I think, Salma, the issue is with how people perceive it, right? And I've written about this before, where it's not about having equal rights and being able to do the same thing that a man can do. It's about being respected for the thing that a woman wants to do. If I want to be a stay-at-home mother, if I want to work in the kitchen, that work should be equally respected and valued, because caregiving is just, and we saw when COVID hit, just how integral caregiving was to our society, and we don't appreciate it as much as we should. So when it comes to Arab women and domesticity, I think the issue becomes when it's done out of, circumstance, not out of choice, when you're forced to be in the kitchen. That's where the crux of the issue is. But I think when you have the choice and you're able to say, I want to be here because I find a source of power in this place, I am able to, whether it's write about it, I am able to influence a future generation through it, I'm able to educate people about it, then it's actually not at all wrong to be in a place of domesticity. I don't think and I've been in boardrooms, I've been at meetings with CEOs and presidents and all kinds of people. And I don't think that being in those places it might seem more glamorous, but I don't think it's any more important than being at home and cooking Absolutely. And caring for a future generation.
Yeah. So. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing wrong with domesticity when it has been enforced, like you said, without much choice or empowerment given to women. I suppose that is where the issue is. I am curious about the reference you mentioned briefly about grouping or homogenizing cuisines or dishes or cultures under a bigger generic umbrella of, let's say, Middle Eastern food,
right,
or Arab food, quote unquote. What do you think of that? I'm sure there's dangers in such a notion, but also advantages. And I loved what you wrote about the national cuisines is actually useful.
Right.
That article, right?
Right. Yes.
I'd love to hear what you have to say about this.
So, I mean, the issue with it's not so much about the generalization as it is about the terms that are used, right? So Middle East, the issue with it that I had was it's a very Western centric term, right? We are the Middle East relative to a British Empire that sees India as farthest east and sees us in the middle. So it's vague, it's Eurocentric, and it doesn't actually describe anything whatsoever. Calling it Arab cuisine, on the other hand, is fine. It's different because what connects the 22 countries from the Atlantic Ocean to the Arabian Gulf is the fact that we had such a long history of centuries of acculturation under Arab and Islamic rule. So from that perspective, I think it's okay to call it Arabic food. Still, within Arab cuisine, there are so many differences, right? Like you cannot possibly compare Moroccan food to Syrian very closely. But the deeper you dig, you also start to realize even within Syrian cuisine, within Palestinian, within Moroccan, even nationalizing it is still very broad because food at the end of the day is regional, right? So even within, and I wrote a piece about this once, which is like even in a small place like Palestine, you share a lot of dishes, you share a lot of things, but the cuisine is still largely regional. If you go to the north of the country, you will notice that not only the dishes, but the customs and the traditions around eating them are very different to Gaza, which is much further south and borders Egypt, versus the West Bank, which is in the middle and borders Jordan. So it's influenced by climate, it's influenced by socioeconomic status, city versus village. This is where the rice burgos thing comes in, bordering countries and whatnot. So it is useful sometimes to have an overarching umbrella, but you also realize that you lose a lot in the process. So I think it's fine when you're first introducing people to something to say, yeah, this is Arab cuisine, this is Chinese, this is Indian. But once you become more familiar with it, you realize there's so much hiding underneath that.
Yeah, I agree with you. There is perhaps a strength that comes from the feeling of unity, but perhaps it's different when it comes to, and I'm talking about the idea of national cuisines. I generally come from the school of viewing it as actually quite dangerous because it homogenizes a lot in terms of the diversity, the populations that are inhabiting a certain geography, especially when it comes to the issues of representation, migrant communities, marginalized communities, contested communities. But then when it comes to the Palestinian cause, linking back to what we were talking about at the beginning, does it, or let's say, how much of a purpose does it offer, does it provide in maintaining and holding on to a Palestinian identity?
A lot, I think, and I've said this before, for us, it's not just about the food, right? The food is a proxy for something much bigger. To us, our identity is constantly questioned, right? Like, oh, what is Palestinian? There is no such thing as Palestinian. What is Palestine? It was a land without a people for a people without, all these, this rhetoric that we've been used to hearing all the time. So to sit there and try to dissect it and say, I'm from Hebron, I'm from Gaza, I'm from here, I'm from there, that doesn't serve our purpose, which is to say, no, there is a Palestinian cuisine. And yes, it varies from neighborhood to, from location to location, the same way it might between neighbors. But at the end of the day, we're all united in the fact that we are Palestinian, that we have this connection to the land. And even the differences amongst our cuisine, while visible, are marginal, right? Yes, it's different kinds of dishes are used at celebratory event. Different kinds of dishes might be considered your national dish in your specific area. But for Palestinians, food is a way to assert that we exist and always have. It's a way to document our history. It's also a way for us to show a sense of unity to the world. It's also a way to counteract the fact that, when someone says, this food is Israeli, well, but actually it's been around for way longer than Israel has, because my great-grandmother used to make it, but so did this other great-grandmother who lived halfway across the country. And what unites us all is that we are Palestinian.
How different are or what are the key differences in maybe key regions in Palestine?
Sure. So if you go to the Galilee, for example, which borders Syria and Lebanon, you notice a much heavier reliance on mezze dishes, like smaller plates, dishes like kubiniye, dishes that in some places can be eaten, enjoyed with kara, because you have a bigger Christian population there than you do in some other places. And you see the heavy influence of Syrian and Lebanese cuisine on it. You also, if you start to go down more to the West Bank, you see, for example, dishes like mansaf, which are more Bedouin dishes, right? But you have Bedouin communities from Jordan that border the West Bank. If you go more to Gaza, you start to see things like a heavy reliance on chili peppers, on dill, which a lot of them are things that are influenced by Egyptian cuisine, which borders them. But then forget just what borders. Let's say you go to Hebron. There are certain, for example, this is, there's a dessert that is basically just snow topped with dibs inab, grape molasses. And really, the only reason they have it there and nowhere else is because it snows in Hebron, but rarely snows in any other place in Palestine. So it's, sometimes it's very small things, like the climate that you have influences what you can grow. That's why there are dishes, certain wild herbs that you forage for that you might find in the Galilee that you won't find in Gaza. Yeah. But again, the biggest change, it's a lot of it, you start to see it's very, if you want to look at the differences, look at the surrounding areas as well. Like you'll see the Galilee is similar to Lebanon and Syria, West Bank to Jordan, Gaza, Egypt, and so on.
I know the snow cone is enjoyed in Lebanon as well in the snow. You know,
Probably, yeah, there you go.
yeah. So and I know perhaps seafood is
Oh yes, of course, the coast. Yeah.
right.
Yeah, absolutely. And also Akka and Haifa, for example, and Yafa, you'll see a lot more fish dishes in coastal towns than you do in inland towns. Also, if you go to Syria, you'll notice a heavy reliance on sumat versus lemon because they didn't have lemon trees in specific areas.
Oh,
So you see these things, right? You know, a lot of it's small details. Sometimes it slips my mind when I'm so deep down in like the trenches with all the different ones. But here,
yeah.
those are some.
Speaking of being so deep in what you're doing, now that you're abroad,
Mhm.
when you go back and visit, do you feel that there's certain things that you might have, overlooked or maybe, didn't notice as a child or growing up? There are a lot of things that we might have been, let's say, desensitized to, or we're taken for granted, but then suddenly you go like, oh, whoa, this is actually amazing.
So there's a lot of those things. I mean, there's a lot of dishes that I refused to eat growing up, and suddenly when I left, they became like these delicious things. But it's also just there's a lot about the culture that I took for granted, right? You know, this idea that you saw your extended family every single weekend, and that you had dinner together even as a small family every night, and that cooking was such a big part of the culture, and that it was so generous, right? Like you didn't have to plan a dinner or a get together weeks in advance. Someone could knock on your door and you always had something to serve them. And if an unexpected guest came to dinner, there was more than enough food. And those are things that when I've lived in so many different countries at this point, I realize not all cultures have that. For a lot of cultures, it's very, it's counted out. It's very, it's portioned. It's not as generous. It's not as family oriented, etc.
Yeah.
But then I also realized that having lived abroad for so many years now, there's also a lot that I romanticize and that I'm nostalgic for that when I go back has changed now. Like all these things I tell you about families being together all the time, and people are getting busier back home too.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are becoming more, I don't want to say insular, but it's also possible the last 2 times I've been back, it's been COVID, but it's not as, let's say, social and family oriented, at least in the big cities, as it was historically. In the villages, I still see it where my grandparents live. And my cousins, you still see a lot more of that than you do in the cities, but the cities are becoming more and more and more westernized, which is also sad because it's a kind of loss.
Of course, but I mean, it's kind of, I feel like there's a resistance, there's a wave of reappreciation.
I think you're right.
Right?
Yeah, I see it.
It's coming back.
I see it with younger generations. I also see it a lot with people abroad. Like I look at, the immigrants here, Arab immigrants, there's a much stronger
sense of community.
Yeah, and you hold on to these traditions so much. Like I look at my in-laws, they immigrated here, in the 60s, and they still hold on to traditions that people back home have long since forgotten. And to me, that's good. Because it's like you're keeping it alive. Yes, maybe they're not doing it as much back home, but this stuff is fluid now with people travel and live in different places. I think, like you said, it'll, at least in some parts, it'll come back.
Yeah. No, that's great. What would be your go-to dish if someone called you up and said, Reem, I'm coming in, let's say half hour? What would you cook?
Oh my God.
From
in half hour? I mean, so I always have chicken broth in the freezer that I make. And I always have meat as well. So I would probably make hashwa or frika just because they're super easy and super quick. Hashwa is when you chop these really fine cubes of beef or lamb and you cook them with rice and spices and chicken broth.
I thought do you use mince in the hashwa?
So yes, you can use mince. Actually, most people use mince. It's much easier. I personally prefer the texture when you dice the meat yourself. And when you take it out of the freezer and you dice it when it's half frozen, you can actually control it. So they literally come out like the size of lentils. And it's the texture is slightly different from using mince. It's falfal is the word in Arabic, but it's a lot, it's not clumpy. It's like every grain is separate, every piece of meat. It's very good. Yeah. So I would do that with salad and something, or frika with.
Yeah. Falfel would be perhaps, I don't know, fluffy. I mean, how does you work
Fluffy.
around translation of some of these words?
Some things just don't have translation, like
Right?
zanakha doesn't have translation,
Absolutely.
falfel doesn't. I tried to write a whole article on the meaning of nafas. I don't know if it came across, but yeah.
Yes, it's hard to catch, hard to
Some stuff, yeah, which just shows you how rich the culture is, right? Like there is
absolutely. Just it's absolutely it's different, and it's rich, and it pays attention to different things, it values different things that
exactly
might go unnoticed. Ka'k al-Quds.
Yes.
We asked you to pick one ingredient, a single dish or a single, item to talk to us about. So you picked ka'k al-Quds.
So I think it's interesting, right? Ka'k al-Quds, like it's the one dish that's so synonymous with that one place. And I guess one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it is it's suddenly becoming so popularized in the West, and people are calling it Jerusalem sesame bagels, right? And that always bothered me. Like, why are you calling it a sesame bagel? It's, it's ka'k and it's from Jerusalem and whatnot, but calling it a bagel almost implies that it's not Palestinian. But then while researching my second book, I was looking through a 13th century Syrian cookbook. It's translated to English as Scents and Flavors. In Arabic, it's called Kitab al-Wusla ila al-Habib.
Right.
And there's an entire chapter on it on baked breads. And in that chapter is a section on something called ka'k. And they even say ka'k is such, and I think they were referring in part to, ka'k that's smaller and more crispy as opposed to specifically this particular ka'k, but they're all related. And anyway, they say ka'k is so popular that we don't even need to put recipes for it in this book, but we are going to include a few recipes for ones that are slightly different. One of them was a variety called mfakhar, I think, which is put on a dowel. It is boiled, and then it is baked.
Uh-huh.
And that is basically how the bagel is cooked. So I wrote a piece for Serious Eats about the potential Arab origins of the bagel. And if you start to look at the trade routes, where the Islamic Empire trade routes stretched, you start to realize that there are these bagels and all kinds of places you wouldn't expect to find them. Like if you go to the Uyghur people in China, they have something called gerdanan, which looks exactly like a bagel. And if Poland, which is where a lot of Jews trace the bagel to, the Polish family actually had something that was identical called an obroznik, which was brought there from an Italian princess who married into the royal family in Poland, and she came from Bari in Italy, and Bari in Italy was the strongest foothold for the Arab Empire in the Mediterranean. So you start to see, like, the dots start to connect about how it is very, is it bulletproof? No, but it is very possible that the Arab ka'k was the precursor to the bagel and to this ka'k al-Quds. And so I wanted to discuss this just because it's a very unheard of history. And it's also a very distinct product that even Palestinians tell you, like they make it in other places. They make it in Safad and Akka and Haifa, etc. But everyone says ka'k al-Quds is just different. And nobody knows why, right? Is it something psychological? Or is there really something to do with the ovens, the yeast that's in the walls, right? Like when I wrote this article about nafas, I spoke to some scientist who said, if you make sourdough in a lab versus a kitchen, even in an identical process, it actually tastes different because of what microbiomes exist in different places.
Yeah.
So,
or on your own hands.
On your hands, exactly.
Yeah.
So what? Yeah.
I was looking up the etymology of samit, the Turkish bagel, and I was amazed to find that the Arabic word samata, sin, means to dip in water or to dip something.
Yep.
And it makes perfect sense that's the technique in making samit or certain bagels, is to dip them in boiled water before they get baked.
Exactly. And here's another surprise, which was also a surprise for me about Turkish cuisine. A lot of people will say, oh, you talk about appropriation. Well, look how much you took from the Ottomans. But actually, the very, very first Turkish cookbook that was published in the 15th century was just a translation of a 12th century Arabic cookbook, also called Kitab al-Tabikh. So they literally took that book, translated it, added a couple recipes, and that became the first Turkish cookbook. So their cuisine actually relied on Arabic cuisine. And this is where you see, like I said, fusion is the history of food in general. And there's nothing wrong with learning from other cultures, with adopting, but it is important to give credit where it's due, or at the very least, not try to erase the existence and history of the cultures that came before you and enriched your own.
Yeah, and I guess this is what the whole idea of cultural appropriation, being anti-cultural appropriation is like, you want to enjoy the food, great, amazing.
But
how do you enjoy it? Come back for more. Our doors are always open, but
acknowledge where you got it from. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm gonna jump on to a quick Q&A. What are you reading or watching right now?
Oh goodness. I'm watching, this is bad. I'm binge watching a very old show. It's called Scandal.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's like it's a Shonda Rhimes show actually. So I watched Bridgerton. I watched all these silly things. I was very into Korean shows for a while, like Crash Landing on You and
Really?
all these. Again, I do a lot of like serious work and depressing work. So sometimes when I want to watch or read, I'm like, I want something light and easy. So this is a very silly political show that I'm watching. It's called Scandal. What am I reading? Hold on, I will tell you. I read a bunch of different books all at the same time. So I'm reading a book called The Expectation Effect. I'm also rereading Pachinko. I've read it already once, but I love it. And then I have a bunch of cookbooks.
Pachinko, the Korean book?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm watching the series. I didn't know it was a book.
Oh, so it's a book. And the author was actually working on the series, and then because of some creative disputes, she left it. I started watching the series, could not finish. I didn't like it. I didn't because I had read the book.
So the book is
the book is way better. Oh yeah, I'm reading it for a second time. That's how much I like it.
The story is amazing, though.
The story is so good, but the
women from over generations is just
It really reminded me of Palestinians in many ways. That might be one of the reasons I loved it so much. But I think the show takes a lot of creative liberties that don't do the story as much justice as it should.
Yeah.
But I'll finish it if you say it's good. So
I will let you know.
Yeah.
I'm still like in episode 3, so I'll let you know. Who would you shadow for a day, Reem?
Oh God, can we come back to that one? I have to think about it. See what I love to shadow for a day. Past or present.
Let's do the next
and I'll keep thinking. Okay.
Guilty midnight food choice.
Oh, there's so many of those. So if you want to laugh, like normally, because I go for something easy, there's a snack called bamba, which it's actually I guess it's an Israeli snack. It's very bad. It's peanut butter based. Bamba, Bamba.
I don't know.
Anyway, so again, but it's actually Palestinians make it too. So I grew up eating it. So at midnight, because I don't want to cook or I don't want to do anything, I'll go downstairs and have a bag of bamba with fruits. I eat the fruits to feel less. It's almost like cheese puffs, but peanut butter flavored.
Oh, interesting. It's the first time hearing about it.
Really?
And it's
so
where would you find it? Like
I buy it at Trader Joe's.
Okay, interesting.
In the US at Trader Joe's. Growing up, I used to buy it at any Arabic supermarkets. It used to come in different flavors. It's essentially a corn puff flavored with something, cheese or whatnot, but anything like that, any kind of corn puff, cheese puff, whatever with some fruits. I feel like the fruit counteracts the unhealthy benefits of that. And then Asian dumplings are always a guilty pleasure, no matter what time of day.
I love dumplings. Okay, what dish reminds you most of home?
Djaj mahshi, probably stuffed chicken, just because it was always my favorite dish growing up. It's what my mother makes when I go home. So
Is it the one in your book? Is the one that
it is? Yes.
With that exact recipe?
It is, yeah. Although now I've taken to deboning the chicken. I don't recommend doing that. It's a very complicated process, but it allows you to stuff it with even more rice and eat it more easily. What?
Unless the butcher can do it.
Yeah, except you need them. So an alternative, which is what I've taken to doing now because it's so much easier and quicker, is I only debone the legs or the thighs. and then I stuff those. And then you get the best of both worlds. It's easier to debone it. You don't have to sit there and sew it. My husband says you should go into plastic surgery while you're sewing these chickens.
Yeah, no, not too late to start another career.
I know, right?
How many careers can you fit in a lifetime?
Right. I think the medicine one is out the window now, but yeah.
All right. I mean, if you do remember who you want to shadow for a day, let me know. But in the meantime,
I don't know, just thinking about this now, like I feel almost, I wouldn't have thought of this before, but given what we're living through right now, I would actually have wanted to shadow Shireen Abu Akleh, just because I grew up listening to her voice, right, all the time. We actually grew up on the same street.
No way.
Yeah, we didn't know each other personally just because of the age difference, but we were literally like 5-6 houses apart. But it's interesting because, you know, the work she does, obviously, as now we see, was very dangerous, but it was also a way of sharing people's stories with the world in a different medium on a different topic.
That's, I just saw a video of her cooking. I don't know if
Oh, did you? I have not seen it. No, if you could share it, I would love to.
Made mahashi mzawarat, she called it.
Oh, really?
Stuffed vine leaves and a bunch of other things. And she was just saying she never, it's like I think she said it's like the first time she made it that good.
That's so funny. Haram, yeah. Yeah, if you email me, I'd love to see it.
Of course, yeah, of course. All right, what do you say we open up the floor for any questions?
Absolutely.
In the chat. From Miranda Al-Khazan, she's saying, assuming ingredients matter, is it hard to find ingredients which come from Palestine? Does it sadden you that these aren't represented more in the stores?
So I assume the question is referring to the USA. Ingredients absolutely matter. Yes, they do. And is it hard to find ingredients which come from Palestine? Yes, definitely. But there has been more, like there's a lot of cooperatives now that do try to source things from Palestinian farmers. I see it in the UK as well. You know, things, it's simple things, right? Like zayt, za'atar, olives, cheese sometimes. And does it, you know, it saddens me that you cannot find them as much in stores here. On the other hand, though, it's also a good thing. Because if you think about it, like think of what the popularity of quinoa did to the people of Peru. Like these things that are your staples, when there becomes such huge demand for them abroad and you start outsourcing them there, suddenly they become so much more expensive and inaccessible for the local people who have relied on them for centuries. So I think it's okay that we have to find alternatives here. I grow my own za'atar outside. I make my own cheese. Sometimes I'll buy olive oil that's not Palestinian, although most of the time my parents send me olive oil that they make. But I think it's okay sometimes to not have everything available everywhere in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question is, can you recommend some great food history books, Arab world related or otherwise?
Yes, so I'm just going to open up my books here. So I used Kitab al-Tabikh, which I reference a lot. I used a translation for it as well by Nawal Nasrallah. It's called Annals of the Caliph's Kitchen.
Right.
So that one was good. There were a few books actually that there's a researcher called Charles Perry. He writes a lot about the Arab world, Middle East. And, you know, if you look him up, you will see different chapters for him. Sorry.
He has the scents and flavors.
So he translated that one. That's the 13th century book that I was telling you the bagel thing was in. So that one's his. I'm looking through my list. So hold on. I mean, obviously I used the Cambridge World History of Food and whatnot. There's one called Food and World History, but these are all very broad, right? Like you're going to have to dig into the chapters that are relevant to you. There's Medieval Cuisine of the Islamic World. There's The Culinary Crescent by Peter Hine. There's a lot of good ones. I mean, I'm happy to send you a list if people want it. Like if you have my book, The Arabesque Table, there's actually an entire bibliography at the end.
Yeah, that's great. In fact, we have another Matbakh talk tomorrow with the writer-translator of 15th century Egyptian cookbook.
Oh, the one that I saw that just come out.
Daniel Newman, yes. So anyone who's interested and would love to tune in, would love to have you tomorrow also to continue the chat on some of what we touched on today about food history in the region. Okay, I've got another question on what is one utensil you cannot work without? This is from Mira.
I'd say Mira, it's a toss-up between my lemon squeezer and my really sharp chef's knife. I use both equally. There's so much lemon in our food, so constantly the lemon squeezer, but you can't do anything without a good knife. And actually good kitchen shears, scissors. Yeah.
Awesome. If anyone would like to unmute themselves and just go in with a question, please feel free. Lemia is saying, please, it would be great to send us a list of the cookbooks. And we've got a question from Zaindin Hanbali. What is your opinion about people who put knafe inside of pita bread?
So I'd say most of these, I mean, I've only seen it in Lebanese restaurants, right? I don't particularly like it that way. To me, knafe is just, you already have that salty, crunchy bit from the cheese has a bit of salt in it. The pastry is so crunchy that I think it doesn't need anything. It's perfect as is. On the other hand, I do come from like a triple carb culture where I eat my kafta or ruzz batata with bread. So I'm not one to judge someone for putting anything inside a pita bread.
Amazing. Okay, so we've got a question from Sally that I'm scrolling up to. Oh yeah, what's your favorite Palestinian dessert?
Oh, I do like knafe very much. And I think that one you can actually say is Palestinian. Tabba also is very, very good.
What is
those two.
Tabba?
And tabba, so it's this really thin dough. It's cooked on the spot, right? But I guess you could say it's similar to phyllo pastry, and it's stuffed with either cheese or walnuts. And it's folded in tabba because it's being folded. And then it's doused with sugar syrup once it's cooked.
Oh, so does it get fried?
No, it gets baked.
Okay, because I was thinking tamriya in my head.
Oh, yeah. No, it's slightly different, but
okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. I love.
They're all very similar. The concept is very similar, right? This thin dough that's stuffed with something that's either baked or fried and then soaked in syrup. They exist all over the Arab world.
We've got a question from Adam saying most cooks love to cook alone and show off their abilities. You as an individual, do you like cooking? Do you like people giving you a hand, or does that annoy you? Love the question.
So I don't know. I mean, to me, it's never about showing off my ability. Obviously, I know how to cook. The people who know me know that I know how to cook, but I'm very particular in how I work in the kitchen. It's like very methodical, very clean, right? I work and I clean as I go along, and so I do love help if someone wants to chop something for me, but what I can't have is someone hovering around me while I'm cooking, giving me, oh, why are you doing it like this? No, you need to do that. It's like, no, God, please, like, no, just, and this particularly happens, right, with like the older women in my family.
Yeah, I know. If you have people over and you're cooking for them,
I know.
Make sure you do the cooking before anyone comes in.
I prep as much as I can beforehand because it's like, there are people that are set on a certain way of doing things, right? But then it's like I do a lot of research and I experiment and whatnot. So sometimes it's like this feeling of having to justify everything. That gets on my nerves, but I love having people around. That's never an issue for me.
Or the question of how can I help? Reem, give me something to do. And I'm like,
just talk to me, but
yeah,
it'll take me more time to explain to you than to do it myself.
Exactly that. Okay, what cuisine would you like
that's super easy.
Other than the Palestinian or Arabic one?
I'm obsessed with, I alternate between Indian cuisine. That's the one most probably.
And so Lamia is asking, I still didn't buy the Arabesque Table. What Arabic cuisines do you cover in it?
So it's not divided by geography, right? So it's not like I cover all the different parts of the Arab world. It's split up by ingredient. And the reason I do that is it's easier to trace the history by tracing the ingredients themselves and how they've traveled and come along. There are dishes that are, inspired from North Africa, from Sudan, from obviously the Levant is the bulk of it, just because that happens to be, what I know and research the most. Some things from the Gulf, not as much, but yeah, I mean, I would say it's also if you're buying it thinking you're going to get like this historic thing about traditional Arabic dishes, you get the information, but the recipes, a lot of them are much more dishes that are adapted to today's kitchen and today's cooking.
Okay, a quite close question. What cuisine is the most similar to Palestinian cuisine?
So all the cuisines of the Levant are very similar. And if you think about it, we were all really just the same area, especially under Ottoman rule. And even going further back than that, there was no major separation between Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, right? Like my great grandmother is actually from Syria. And I think anyone you speak to has someone from their family who's from one of those places or the other. So all those cuisines are the same or similar.
More or less. All right. Well, that wrapped up our questions, and Reem, I'm so happy that we've done this tonight and had the chance.
Me too. This was fun.
Chat. Thank you everyone for joining us. This is Reem's Instagram, I suppose. Yes. Reem Kassis. If you want to follow, please do, and stay in touch. This is also Afikra's link. To give us feedback. We'd love to hear from you, and of course any way that you can support our community would be much appreciated. Thank you so much, Reem, once again, and everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was so fun, and thank you guys all for tuning in.
Thank you, Reem. Have a great night.
You too. Bye.